Hi friends, today we are going to see a new topic of William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth, 7th April 1770 to 23rd April 1850, was an English romantic poet who with Samuel Taylor helped to launch the Romantic age in the English literature with their joint publication of Lyrical in 1798. Wordsworth's magnum opus is generally considered to be the Prelude, a semi-autobiographical poem of his early years that was revised and expanded a number of times. It was posthumously titled and published by his wife in the year of his death, before which it was generally known as the poem of Coleridge. Wordsworth was a poet litigator from 1843 until his death from pleurisy on 23rd April 1850. Early life of Wordsworth. The second of fifth children born to John Wordsworth and Anne Cookson, William Wordsworth was born on April 7, 1770 in what is now named as Wordsworth House in Cockermouth, the Cumberland, now in Cumbria, a part of an Celtic region in the northwestern England known as the Lake District. William's sister, the poet, and the dietary Dorothy Wordsworth, to whom he was close all his life, was born the following year. And the two were baptized together. They have three other siblings. Richard, the eldest, who became a lawyer. John, born after Dorothy, who went to sea and died in 1805, when the ship of which he was a captain, the Earl of Abernethy, was wrecked off the south coast of England. And the Christopher, the youngest, who entered the church and rose to be a master of Trinity College in Cambridge. Wordsworth's father was a legal representative of James Lowther, first Earl of Lancashire, and through his connections lived in a large mansions in the small town. He was frequently away from the home on business. So the young William and his siblings had a little involvement with him and remained distant from him until his death in 1783. However, he did encourage William in his readings and in particular set him to commit a large portions of verse to memory, including the words by Milton, Shakespeare and Spenser's. William was also allowed to use his father's library. William also spent time at his mother's parents' house, which is located in Penrith, Cumberland, where he was exposed to the Moors but did not get along with his grandparents or his uncle, who also lived there. His hostile interactions with them distressed him to the point of competing suicide. Wordsworth was taught to read by his mother and attended the first tiny schools of low quality in Cockermouth, then a school in Penrith for the children of upper class families, where he was taught by Anne Bricket, who insisted on installing in her student traditions that included the pursuing both scholarly and local activities, especially the festival around Easter, May Day and Shrove Tuesday. Wordsworth was taught both the Bible and the Spectator, but little else. It was at the school in the Penrith that he met in Hutchins, including Mary, who late became his wife. After the death of Wordsworth's mother in 1778, his father sent him to Hackseat grammar schools in Clancher, now in Cumbria, and sent Dorothy to live with her relatives in Yorkshire. She and Williams did not meet again for 9 years. Wordsworth made his debut as a writer in 1787 when he published a sonnet, the European magazine. That same year, he began attending St. John's College in Cambridge. He received a BA degree in 1791. He returned to Hackheath for the first 2 summers on his time at Cambridge and often spent later holidays on walking tours, visiting places famous for the beauty of their landscapes. In 1790, he went on walking on tour of Europe, during which he toured the Alps extensively and visited nearby areas of France, Switzerland, and Italy. Relationship with Auntie Valen. In November 1791, Wordsworth visited revolutionary France and became enamored with the Republican movement. He fell in love with the French woman Auntie Valen, who in 1792 gave birth to their daughter Caroline. Financial problems and Britain's tense relations with France forced him to return to England alone the following years. The circumstances of his return and his subsequent behavior raised doubts as to his declared wish to marry Annette. However, he supported her and his daughter as the best he could in later life. The region of Territor left Wordsworth throughoutly disillusions with the French Revolution and the outbreak of armed hostilities between Britain and France prevented him from seeing Annette and his daughter for some years. With the Peace of Amiens again allowed to travel to France in 1802, Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy visited Annetta and Caroline in Calais. The purpose of the visit was to prepare Annette for the fact of his forthcoming marriage to Mary Hutchins. Afterwards, he wrote the sonnet, "It is a beauteous evening, calm and free," recalling a seaside walk with a 9-year-old Caroline, whom he had never seen before the visit. Mary was anxious that the Wordsworth should do more for Caroline. Upon the Caroline's marriage in 1816, Wordsworth settled euros of 30 a year on her, equivalent to euros of 2,313 in 2021. Payment which continued until 1835, when they were replaced by a capital settlement. The early years of Wordsworth. First publication and Lyrical Ballads. The year 1793 saw the first publications of the poem by Wordsworth in the collection An Evening Walk and Desperate Sketches. In 1795, he received a legacy of euros 900 from Rydal Coleridge and became able to pursue a career as a poet. It was also in 1795 that he met a Samuel Taylor Coleridge in the Somerset. The two poets quickly developed a close friendship. For 2 years from 1795, Williams and his sister Dorothy lived at the Racedown houses in Dorset, a property of the Penniless family to the west of Pilden's Pen. They walked in the area for about 2 hours every day, and nearby the hills consoled Dorothy as he pinned her for the fields of her native Lakeland, she wrote. We have hills which, seen from a distance, almost take the characters of mountains, some cultivated nearly to the sunsets, others in their white state covered with the furs and brown. These delight me the most as they reminded me of our native wilds. In 1797, the pair moved to Alfoxden House, Somerset, just a few miles away from the Coleridge home in Nether Stotway. Together, the Wordsworth and Coleridge, with insights from Dorothy, produced a Lyrical Ballads in 1798, an important work in the English Romantic movement. The volume gave neither a Wordsworth nor the Coleridge named as author. One of the Wordsworth's most famous poem, Tintern Abbey, was published in his collections along with the Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The second edition, published in 18,000, had only Wordsworth listed as the author and included a preface to the poems. It was augmented significantly in the next edition, published in 1802. In these prefaces, which some scholars considered a central work of Romantic literacy theory, Wordsworth discusses what he sees as the element of a new type of verse. On that is based on ordinary language, really based on used by the man, while avoiding the poetic dictations of much in 18th century verses. Wordsworth also gives his famous definitions of the poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from the emotions recollected in the poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from the emotions recollected in the quantity, and calls his own poems in the book experimental. A fourth and a final edition of Lyrical Ballads was published in 1805. The Borderer. Between the 1795 and 1797, Wordsworth wrote his only play, The Borderers, a verse tragedy set during the reigns of Henry King III of England. When the Englishmen in the North Country came into the conflict with the Scottish border ravagers, he attempted to get the play staged in November 1797. But it was rejected by Thomas Harris, the manager of the Covent Garden Theatre, who proclaimed it impossible that the play should succeed in the presentation. The rebuff was not revised lightly by the Wordsworth, and the play was not published until 1842, after the substantial revision. Germany and the move to the Lake District. Wordsworth, Dorothy and Coleridge travelled to Germany in the autumn of 1798. While the Coleridge was intellectually stimulated by the journey, its main effects on Wordsworth was to produce a homesickness. During the harsh winter of 1798-99, Wordsworth lived with Dorothy in Goslers, and despite the extreme stress and the loneliness, began works on autobiographical pieces that was later titled The Prelude. He wrote a number of other famous poems in Goslers, including the Lucy poem in the Autumns of 1799. Wordsworth and his sister returned to England and visited the Hutchison family at Stockburn. When Coleridge arrived back in England, he travelled to the north with their publisher Joseph Cottle to meet Wordsworth and undertake a proposed tour of the Lake District. This was immediate cause of the brothers and the sisters at Dow Cottage in Grasmere in the Lake District. This time with another poet, Robert Scotty, nearby. Wordsworth, Coleridge and Southey came to known as the Lake Poets. Throughout this period, many of the Wordsworth poems revolved around the themes of death, endurance, separation and grief, marriage and children. In 1802, Lowther Hare the William Lowther, 1st Earl of Losland, paid the euro of 4,000 owed to Wordsworth farther throughout the Lowther failure to pay his abide. It was his repayment that affords Wordsworth the financial means to marry. On the 4th October, the following his visit with Dorothy to the France to arrange matters with Anity, Wordsworth married his childhood friend Mary Hutchinson. Dorothy continued to live with the couple of grew close to Mary. The following year, Mary gave birth to the first of 5 children, 3 of whom preceded her and Williams. John Wordsworth, 18 June 1803 to 25 July 1875, Vicar of Braham's, Cumberland, and Rector of Palmyra, Cumberland, buried at Hitchgate Cemetery, West Side, married 4 times. First, Isabel Cruven died in 1848, had 6 children. Janie Stanley, Henry, William, John, Charles, and Edward. James Stanley, 1833 to 1912, who married Reverend Bennett Shedard Kennedy, an illegitimate son of Robert Sheard, the 6th Earl of Harborough, and their son Robert Harborough Sheard became first biographer to his friend Oscar Wilde. Second, Helen Rose, died in 1854, no children. Third, Mary Ann Dolan, died after 1858, had 1 daughter, Dora. Dora Wordsworth, 1858 to 1934. Fourth, a Mary Gamble with no children. Dora Wordsworth, 16 August 1804 to 9 August 1847. Married Edward Qualina in 1841. Thomas Wordsworth, 15th June 1806 to 1 December 1812. Catherine Wordsworth, 6 September 1808 to 4th June 1812. William Willie Wordsworth, 12th May 1810 to 1883. Married Fanny Graham and had 4 children. Mary Lucia, William, Reginald, and Gordon. Later career. The autobiographical Word and the Poems in 2 volumes. Wordsworth had for years been making a plan to write a long philosophical poems in 3 parts, which he intended to call the Resolute. In 1798-99, he started an autobiographical poem, which he referred to as the Poem of Coleridge, and which he planned would serve as an appendix to a larger work called the Resolute. In 1804, he began expanding his autobiographical work, having decided to make it a prologue rather than an appendix. He completed his work, now generally referred to as the first version of the Prelude, in 1805, but refused to publish such a personal work until he had completed the whole of the Resolute. The death of his brother John in 1805 affected him strongly and may have influenced his decisions about these works. Wordsworth's psychological elegances as articulated in the Prelude and in such a shorter works as lines written a few miles above the Tintern Abbey have been a source of an critical debate. It was a long suspected that the Wordsworth relied chiefly on Coleridge for the philosophical guidance. But more recently, scholars have suggested that the Wordsworth idea may have been formed years before he had a Coleridge became friends in the mid of 1790s. In particular, while he was in the revolutionary Paris in 1792, the 22 years old Wordsworth made the acquaintance of the mysterious traveler John Walking Stewart in 1747 to 1822. who was nearing the end of his 30 years of wandering on foot from Madras, India, through Persia and Arabia, across Africa and Europe, and up throughout the fledgling United States. By the time of their associations, Stewart had published an ambitious work of original material philosophy entitled The Apocalypse of Nature, London in 1791, to which many of the Wordsworth philosophical sentiments may well be indebted. In 1807, Wordsworth published the poem in 2 volumes, including the ode Intimations of Immortality from the Recollections of Early Childhood. Up to this point, Wordsworth was known only for the Lyrical Ballads, and he hoped that his new collections would cement his reputations. Its reception was lukewarm, however. In 1810, Wordsworth and Coleridge were estranged over the latter opium addiction, and in 1812 his son Thomas died at the age of 6 months after the death of 3-year-old Catherine. The following year, they received an appointment as a distributor of the stamps for the Western lands, and the stipends of €400 a year made his financially rescues. Abbott, at the cost of political independence in 1813, and his family, including the Dorothy, moved to Rydal Mount in Albyside between the Gramercy and Rydal Water, where he spent the rest of his life. The Prospectors. In 1814, Wordsworth published The Exhaustion as the second part of the 3-part work, The Resuel, even though he never complained that the first part of the 3rd part. He did, however, write a poetic prospectus to the Resuel, in which he laid out the structure and intentions of the whole work. The prospectus contains some of the Wordsworth's most famous lines on the relations between the human mind and the nature. My voice proclaims how equally the individual minds and the progressive powers, perhaps no less, of the whole species to the external worlds is lifted, and how executively too. This but a little head of among the men. The external world is fitted to the mind, and the certain by no lower name can it be called, which they with the blended might accomplish. Some modern critics suggested that there was a decline in his work beginning around the mid-1820s, perhaps because most of the concerns in the characters, his early poems, loss, death, endurance, separation and abandonment, had been resolved in his writings and his life. In 1820, he was enjoying a considerable access, accompanying a reversal in the complementary critical opinion of his early works. The poet William Blake, who knew of the Wordsworth work, was struck by the Wordsworth boldness in centering his poetry on the human mind. In the response to the Wordsworth poetic program, that when we look into our minds, into our mind of man, my haunt and the main regions of my song, the exhaustion. The William Blake wrote to his friend Henry Pratt Robinson that the passage caused him a bowel complaint which nearly killed him. Following the death of his friend, the painter William Green in 1823, Wordsworth also mentored his relations with the Coleridge. The two were fully reconciled by 1828. When they were tortured the Rhineland together, Dorothy suffered from a severe ill in 1829 that rendered her an invalid for the remainder of her life. The Coleridge and the Charles Lamb both died in 1834, the loss being a difficult blow to the Wordsworth. The following year saw the Passions of the James Hooks. Despite the death of many contemporaries, the popularity of their poetry ensured a steady stream of young friends and admirers to replace those he lost. Religious beliefs. Wordsworth's youthful political gradations, unlike the Coleridgean, never lead him to rebel against his religious upbringings. He marked in 1812 that he was willing to shed his blood for the establishing the Church of England, reflected in his essential sketches of 1822. The religious conservation also colors the execution in 1814, a long poem that became extremely popular during the 19th century. It features three central characters: the wanderer, the solitary who has experienced the hopes and miseries of the French revolutions, and the pastor who dominates the last third of the poem. Wordsworth's poetic philosophy. Beehler had pointed out the fact that the Wordsworth wanted to invoke the basic feelings that a human heart possesses and expresses. He had revised a philosophical standpoint that St. Coleridge's own, creating the character in such an environment so that the public feels them belonging to the distant place and the time, and it is true that the philosophical realization by William Wordsworth let him choose the language and the sculptural pattern of the poetry that a common man used every day. Cumberland expresses that the conversational aspects of the language emerged through the society necessity. The social necessity possesses the theme of possessing the proper language. Interest and the biases among in the speakers. William Wordsworth had used conversation in his poetry to the let people I emerge into we. The poem Farewell exposes the identification emotional that the poet and his sister nourishes. We leave you here in the solid to dwell with those our latest gift of tender thoughts. Though like the morning in thy saffron coat, bright gown and marigold farewell. Such kind of unconventional tone persists all throughout the poetic journey of the poet that position him as a man in the society who speak to the purpose of communication with a very common mass of the society. Again, the preface to the Lyrical Ballads is the evidence where the poet expresses why he is writing and what he is writing and what purpose it will serve to the humanity. Literatureship and the other honors. Wordsworth remained a formidable presence in his later years. In 1837, the Scottish poet and the playwright Jonah Byle reflected on her long acquaintance with Wordsworth. He looks like a man that one must not speak to unless one had some sensible things to say. However, he does occasionally converse cheerfully and well, and when no one knows the benevolent and the excellence he is, it disposes one to be a very much pleased with him. In 1838, Wordsworth received a honorary doctorate in civil law from the University of Durham, and the following year he was awarded the same honorary degree by the University of Oxford when John Keble praised him as the poet of humanity. Praise greatly appreciated by the Wordsworth. It has been argued that the Wordsworth was a great influence on the Kibbles immensely. The popular book of the devotional poetry, The Christian Year in 1827, in 1842 the government awarded him a civil list pension of 300 euros a year. Following the death of an Robert Southey in 1843, Wordsworth became the poet laureate. He initiated, refused the honor, saying that he was too old. But he accepted when the Prime Minister, Robert Peel, assured him that you shall have nothing required of you. Wordsworth thus became the only poet literature to write no official verses. The sudden death of his daughter Dora in 1847 at the age of 42 was difficult for the aging poet to take and his desperations. He completely gave up writing a new material. The Great Decade in 1797 to 1808. While living with Dorothy at Alfoxden House, Wordsworth became friends with a fellow poet, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. They formed a partnership that would change both poet lives and alter the course of English poetry. Coleridge and Lyrical Ballads. The partnership between the Wordsworth and the Rydal has become a rooted in one marvelous year in 1797 to 98, in which they together wandered in wild poesy, had it two consequences for Wordsworth. First, it turned him away from the long poems on which he had labored since his Cambridge days. These included the poems of social protest like the Salisbury Plain, the loco-desperate poems such as An Evening Walk and Desperate Sketches, published in 1973, and The Borderers, a blank verse tragedy exploring the psychology of guilt, and not published until 1842. Stimulated by the Coleridge and under the healing influences of nature and his sister, Wordsworth began in 1797 to 98 to compose the short lyrical and dramatic poems for which he is the best remembered by many readers. Some of these were affectionate tributes to Dorothy, some were tributes to daffodils, birds and other elements of natural holy plant, and some were portraits of simple rural people intended to illustrate the basic truth of human nature. Many of these short poems were written to guarantee the original program formulated jointly by the Wordsworth and Coleridge and aimed at breaking the decorum of neoclassical verse. These poems appeared in 1798 in a slim, anonymously authorized volume entitled A Lyrical Ballads, which opened with the Coleridge's long poem, The Rim of the Ancient Mariner, and closed with the Wordsworth, the Tintern Abbey. All but three of the interventing poems were the Wordsworth's, and he declared in the preference to a second edition 2 years later. The objective was to choose the incident and situation from the common life and to relate or describe them. In a selection of a language really used by the men, tracking in them the preliminary laws of a nature, most of the poems were dramatic in forms. The primary laws of a nature, most of the poems were dramatic in the form designed to reveal the characters of the speaker. The manifesto and the accompanying poems thus set forth the new style, a new vocabulary, and a new subject for poetry. All of them foreshadowing the 20th century development. moments. The Rusyle and the Prelude. The second consequences of the Wordsworth partnership with Coleridge was the farming of the vastly ambitious poetic design that teased and haunted him for the rest of his life. Coleridge had projected an enormous poem to be called The Brook, in which he proposed to treat all the science, philosophy, and the religion. But he soon laid the burden of writing this poem upon Wordsworth himself. Early as 1798, Wordsworth began to talk in a grand term of his poem, to be entitled The Resolute, to nerve himself up to these enterprises and to test his powers. Wordsworth began writing the autobiographical poem that would absorb him intermittently for the next 40 years. The autobiographic poem that would absorb him intermittently was eventually published in 1850 under the title The Prelude, or The Growth of a Poet's Mind. The Prelude extended the quiet autobiographical mode of resonance that the Wordsworth has begun in the Tintern Abbey, and traces the poet's life from his college days through his university life and his visits to France up to the year in 1799, in which he settled at Grasmere. In thus describes a circular journey, what has been called a long journey home. But the main events in the autobiography are internal. The poem externally describes the way in which the imagination emerges as the dominant facility, exerting into its control over the reason and the world of the senses alike. The Resolute itself was never completed, and only one of its three projected parts was actually written. This was published in 1814 as The Exhaustion, and consisted of 9 long philosophical monologues spoken by the pastoral characters. The first monologue, that is Book 1, contained a version of one of the Wordsworth's great poems, The Ruined Cottage, composed in superb blank verse in 1797. This bleak narrative record the slow, pitiful decline in superb blank verse in 1797. This bleak narrative record the slow, pitiful decline of a woman whose husband has gone off to the army and never returned. For last versions of this poem, Wordsworth added the reconciling conclusions, but the earliest and the most powerful versions was tragically tragic, a turn to the elegiac. In the company of the Dorothy, Wordsworth spent the winter of 1798 to 99 in Germany, where in the remote town of Goslar, in Saxony, he experienced the most intensive isolation had ever known. As a consequence, however, he wrote some of his most moving poetry, including the Lucy and the Mathers, Elegies, and the early drafts towards the Prelude. Upon his return to the England, Wordsworth incorporated several new poems in the second editions of Lyrical Ballads in 18,000. Notably, the two tragic pastorals of A Country's Life, The Brothers and the Michael. At about this time, Wordsworth also wrote the brilliant lyrics that were assembled in his second verse collection, Poems, in 2 volumes, 1807, including the enduring popular I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, also known as Daffodils. All of these poems makes up what is now recognized as his great decade, stretching from his meeting while the Coleridge in 1797 until 1808. One portion of a second part of the Prelude was finished in 1806, but like the Prelude was left in manuscript at the poet's death. This portion, home at Gramercy, joyfully celebrated the Wordsworth taking possession in December 1799 of the Dow Cottage at the Gramercy Westmorland, where he was to reside for 8 of his most productive years. In 1802, during the short-lived Trinity of Amiens, Wordsworth returned briefly to France, where at Calais he met his daughter and made his peace with Anita. Then he returned to England to marry the Hattishans, a childhood friend, and start an English family which had grown to 3 sons and 2 daughters by 1810. In 1805, the drowning of the Wordsworth's favorite brother, John, the captain of a sailing vessel, gave Wordsworth the strongest shock he had never ever experienced. A deep distress had humanized my soul, he laminated in his elegant stanzas as Peely Castle. Henceforth he would produce a different kind of the poetry, defined by a new sobriety, a new resistance, and a lofty, almost the mild tonic elevations of a tone and diction. Wordsworth appeared to be anticipate this turn in the Tintern Abbey, where he has learned to hear the still, sad music of humanity, and again in the ode in Intimations of Immortality, written in 1802 to 1804, published in the poems in 2 volumes. The themes of this ode is the loss of his power to see the things he had only seen once, the radiance, the celestial lights that seems to lie over the landscape of his youth like the glory of the freshness of a dream. Now in the Peely Castle stanzas, he sorrowfully looks back on the light as illusory as a poet's dream, as a light that never was on sea or land. These metaphors point out the difference between the early and the late Wordsworth. It is generally accepted that the quality of his verse fell off as he grew the more distant from the source of his inspiration, as his Anglican and the Tory sentiments hardened into the orthodoxy. Today, many readers discern to Wordsworth the young, romantic, revolutionary, and agony Tory humanist, risen into what Nietzsche called the ecological sublime. Little of the Wordsworth later verses matches the best of his early years. In the middle period of the Wordsworth invested a good deal of his creative energies in odes, the best known of which is one on the power of the sound. He also produced a large number of the sonnets, most of them strung together in the sequence. The most admired are the Dungeon Sonnets in 1820, which trace the program of a stream through the Lake District landscape and blended the nature poetry with the philosophical reflections in a manner now recognized at the best of the later Wordsworth. Other sonnet sequences records his tour through the European continent and the 3 series of the ecclesiastical sketches in 1822. Developed the meditation, many sharply satirical on the church history. But the most memorable poems of the Wordsworth middle and the ladies were often cast in elegiac mood. They range from the poet heartfelt lament for two of his children who died in 1812, the lament incorporated in the exertion, to the brilliant lyrical affections on the death of his fellow poet James Hogg, George Gab, the Coleridge, and the Charles Lamb. Late works of William Wordsworth. In 1808, Wordsworth and his family moved from Dove Cottage to the larger Quads in Grasmere, and 5 years later they settled at Rydal Mount near Ambleside, where the Wordsworth spent the remainder of his life. In 1813, he accepted the post of distributor of the stamp for the country of Westmorland, an appointment that carried the salary of €400 a year. Wordsworth continued to hold back for publications the Prelude, the Home at Grasmere, the Borderer, and the Salisbury Plain. He did publish the poems in 2 volumes in 1807, the Eructions in 1814, containing the only finished portions of the Rescue, and the collected poems of 1815, which contain the most of his shorter poems and 2 important critical essays as well. Wordsworth's other works published during the Middle Ages, including The White Dew of Rylstone in 1815, a poem about the pathetic shattering of a Roman Catholic family during an unsuccessful rebellion against the Elizabeth I in 1569, Thanksgiving Ode in 1816, and the Peterbell in 1819, a poem written in 1798 and the modulated in successive rewritings into an experimental in romantic irony, and the mock heroic and the colored by the poet feelings of affinity with his hero, a wild and a woodland over. The Wagoner 1819 is another extended ballad about a North Country itinerant. Through all the years, the Wordsworth was assailed by the vicious and tireless critical attacks by the Confucius Review. No great poet has never had to endure the worst. But finally, with the publications of the River Darton in 1820, the tide began to turn, and by the mid of 1830, his reputation has been established with both crisis and reading public. Wordsworth's last year were given over partly to tricking his poems, as the family called his compulsive and persistent habit of revising his earlier poems through the editions after editions. The prequel, for the instance, went through 4 distinct manuscript versions in 1798 to 99, 1805 to 1806, 1818 to 1820, and in 1832 to 1839, and was published only after the poet's death in 1815. Most readers find the earliest versions of the Prelude and the other heavily revised poem to be the best, but flashes of the brilliance can appear in the revision added when the poet was in his 70s. Wordsworth succeeded his friend Robert Southey as a British poet literature in 1843, and held the post until his own death in 1815. Hence, after his influence was felt throughout the rest of 19th century, though he was honored more for his smaller poems, as singled out by the Victorian crisis Matthew Arnold, than for his masterpiece. The Prelude in the 20th century, his reputation was strengthened both by the recognition of his importance in the Romantic development movement and by the appreciation of the darker element in his personality and verse. Legacy. William Wordsworth was the central figure in the English Romantic Revolution in poetry. His contribution of it was threefold. First, he formulated in his poem and his essay a new attitude towards the nature. This was more than a matter of introducing a nature imaginary into his verses. It's almost to a fresh view of organic relation between a man and the natural world, and is cumulated in metaphors of a varying between a nature and a human mind and beyond that. In the weeping of metaphor of nature as embedded, emblematic of the mind of a god, a mind that feels upon the infinity and the broods over the dark abysses. Second, the Wordsworth probed deeply into his own sensibility as he traced in his finest poem, the Prelude, the growth of a poet's mind. The Prelude was in fact the first long autobiographical poem written it in a drawn out process of self-exploration. Wordsworth works in his way towards a modern psychological understanding of his own nature and thus more broadly of the human nature. Third, the Wordsworth placed a poetry of the center of human experiences in impassionated rhetoric. He pronounced a poetry to be nothing less than that, the first and the last of all knowledge. It is as immortal as the heart of a man, and he went on to create some of the great English poetry of his century. It is probably safe to say that by the late of 20th century, he stood in a critical estimation where the Coleridge and Arnold has originally placed him next to John Milton, who stands of course next to William Shakespeare. William Wordsworth was one of the founders of the English Romanticism and one of its most central figures and important intellect. He is remembered as a poems of spiritual and epistemological speculation, a poet concerned with the human relationship and to the nature, and a phrase advocate of using the vocabulary and speech patterns of common people in poetry. The son of a John and Anne Cox Wordsworth, William Wordsworth was born on 7th April 1770. Wordsworth, for over 2 centuries after his death, he began writing the poetry as a young boy in the grammar school, and before graduating from the college, he went on a walking tour to the Europe, which, depending his love for the nature and his symphony for the common man, both major themes in his poetry. Wordsworth is best known by the Lyrical Ballads, co-written with Samuel Taylor, and the Prelude, a romantic epic poem concluding the growth of the poet's mind. Wordsworth was deep love for the beauteous forms of the nature's world was established early. The Wordsworth children seems to be here have lived in the sort of a rural paradise along the Dover River, which ran past the terraced garden below the ample house whose tenancy John Wordsworth has obtained for his employer, the political magnate and the property owner Sir James Lowther, the baronet of the Lowood, later Earl of Landosdale. William attended the grammar school near the Cockermouth Church and Anne Brixter schools at Penrith, the home of his material grandparents. The intents of the lifelong friendship between the William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy probably became when they, along with the Mary Hatchins, attended the school at the Pennet. Wordsworth's early childhood, beside the Duvenet and his schoolings at the Cockermouth, are vividly recalled in various pages of the Prelude and the shorter poems such as the sonnet Addresses from the Spirit of the Cockermouth Castle. His experience in and around the Hackwell Huts where the William and the Bridgewoods became the schoolings in 1779, would also provide the poet with the storage of imaginary and the sensory experiences that he would continue to draw out on throughout his poetic career, but especially during the greater decades of 1798 to 1808. His childhood ideally was not to continue. However, in the March of 1778, and Wordsworth died while visiting a friend in London. In the June 1778, Dorothy was sent to live in a Haxiflax, Yorkshire, with her mother's cousin Elizabeth, and she lived with the successions of the relative thereafter. She did not see William again until 1787. In December of 1783, John Wordsworth, returning home from a business trip, lost his way and was forced to spend a cold night in the open. Very ill when he reached home. He died December 30th, though separated from his sister. All the boys eventually attend a school together at Hackworth, staying in a home of the Aunt Tyson. In 1787, despite the poor finance caused by ongoing inundations over the Lord Rother debit to the John Wordsworth estate, Wordsworth went up to Cambridge as a sizar in St. John's College. As he felt later noted, Wordsworth's undergraduate the career was not distinguished by the particular brilliance. In the third book of the Prelude, Wordsworth recorded his reactions of the life at Cambridge and his changing attitude towards his studies. During his last summer as an undergraduate, he and his college friend Robert Jones, much influenced by the William Crookes, the sketches of the natural civil and the political stages of the Switzerland in 1779, decided to make a tour of the Alps, departing from the Doyer on July 13, 1970. Though the Wordsworth, encouraged with his headmaster William Taylor, had been composing very since his days at Hackworth Grammar School, his poetic career began with the first trip to the France and Switzerland. During this period, he also formed his earlier political opinion, easily with especially his hatred of Traiani. These opinions would be profoundly transferred over the coming years but never completely abandoned. While still in the France, Wordsworth began work on first extended poetic efforts of his maturity, the Desperate Sketches, which was published in 1793 after the appearance of the poem written at Cambridge, and Evening Walk in 1793. Having exhausted his money, he left France in early December 1792, before the Anita Wallen gave birth to his child Caroline. A letter to the Bishop of Langstaff is remarkable partly because Wordsworth seems to have begun relinquished in the tenant almost as shown as he had composed them. Though he had remained for the time being a strong supporter of the French Revolution, the poet sides of Wordsworth's personality began asserting himself, causing the poet to re-examine between 1793 and 1796 his adhere to the Godwin's rationalistic model of human behavior, upon which the Wordsworth republication was largely founded. Whether a letter to the bishop, the Landgrave, remained and unpublished through the caution or the circumstances is not clear. As Wordsworth turned his attention to the poetry, he developed through the process of poetic composition his own theory of human nature. On that had a very little to do with the Godwin relationship. During the period of Wordsworth met another radical young man with a literary aspiration, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The poem concludes with a meditation on the power of a nature to prevail against the false and superficial, dreary intercourse of a daily life. That Wordsworth associated with the city life, especially literacy life in London. In the preface, Wordsworth characterized those forces as acting against the elevations of the mind in which the poet specializes, and he identified with them in the urban life. For a multitude of causes unknown to the former times are now acting with the combined force to blunt the discrimination power of the mind and unfitting it for all the voluntary exertion to reduce it to a state of almost savage torpor. The most effective of these causes are the great national events which are daily taking place, and the re-increasing accumulation of the men in cities, where the uniformity of their occupations produces a craving for extraordinary incident which the rapid communication of the intelligent hardly tragic. To this tendency of the life and the manner, the literature of the article exhibitions of the country have conformed themselves. The invaluable works of our elder writers, I had almost said the words of Shakespeare and Milton, are driven into neglect by the frantic novels, stickly and stupid German tragedies, and deluge of the idle and extravagant stories. In 1843, Wordsworth was named as Poet Laureate of England, though by this time he had for the most part quite composed version. He revised and rearranged his poem, published various editions, and retained literacy, guests and friends. When he died in 1850, he had for some more years been ventured as a sage, his most adherent detractors glossing over the radial origins of his poetic and politics. Thank you.